Everyone knows that the Nishtanah has 4 questions, but if you look at the Nishtanah carefully, you'll see that there's actually 5 questions. There's the 4 questions about matzah, maror, the dipping, and the leaning, but there's also a 5th question, which is the opening line. Why is this night different than all other nights? You'll look through the rest of the Seder, you'll see a lot of different things which focus on 4. There are 4 children, the Chacham, the Rasha, the Tam, and the She'eni de Elisha, which we'll discuss later. You have the 4 cups of wine, but you also have a 5th cup of wine. You have the cup of Elijah, which is not drunk. It's just poured for the future. You also really have a 5th son, which is left out, 5th child, I should say, which is the tzaddik, the righteous one. The chacham is a wise one, but that's not exactly the opposite of the rasha, the wicked one. But rather, there's a righteous son, which is left out. We'll discuss that again later on. When we look at the Nishtanah, we say, hey, really there are 4, but there's really 5. And I'd like to explain the structure of the Nishtanah based on the writings of the Maharal Miprag. Maharal Miprag was a rabbi very famously known in Prague in the 1500s, died in approximately 1609, and in modern-day Prague you'll find a statue of him. And if I understand him correctly, he posits the following structure. The Maharal was a great rabbi, and he was also a mystic. And he hints at a mystical structure here, which I'm not going to focus on the mysticism, but on the practical aspects of this mystical model. And the mystical model works something like this. You start off with chesed, with kindness, on one extreme, on the right. On the left, you have din, justice. In the middle, you have tiferes, beauty. Then on the lower right extreme, you have netzach, which is eternity. And on the lower left, you have hod, which is glory. So that's just the central focus of the 10 emanations. Those are 5. But again, it's a sort of a square with a central point. Kindness on the right, justice on the left. Below that is the middle point, which is beauty, tiferes. Below that on the right is eternity. On the left is hod, is glory. And we want to try to figure out how these 4 questions or 5 questions fit into that structure. So let's start with matzah. And we could discuss this in much detail, but very quickly, in summary, I would tell you that there are some that say that matzah represents 2 concepts. And kindness, I talked about kindness. Kindness is the kindness that God shows to the Jewish people in this particular, at this time, in the time of the Exodus of Egypt. And therefore, that would be the freedom that we have. So does matzah represent freedom? Or does matzah represent slavery? So the Ramban Nachmanides, I believe, holds that really it represents both. It's lechem oni, bread of affliction, or poor man's bread. It's also bread of freedom because it celebrates the fact that we ran out in haste from Egypt, that we were free. So it has both aspects. The Maharal, I believe, says differently. He says that the central idea behind matzah is that it's lechem ani, it's poor man's bread. But a man who's poor is not necessarily afflicted, is not necessarily suffering, is not necessarily a slave, but is actually free. Because a poor man doesn't have the connections to wealth that tie him down and that literally enslave him. He's free to be who he is. He's free to express himself. He could be his own individual. He could move as he wants. He's not tied down to any to all the issues that tie us down when we have wealth. Now, many of us would say we're more than happy to have the wealth and be tied down, but the Maharal is seeing this as freedom. And freedom, he also understands it as simplicity, and simplicity is also beauty in a certain sense. I don't want to say beauty. I don't want to mix it up with the middle point. But it's beautiful in the sense that it's just simple. It's not complex. God, we look at it as a simple, unified being, and that's who we want to emanate. We want to be simple like that. We want to have one idea, one truth, and focus on that. So he understands that as to be what matzah is. Matzah represents freedom. And maror is obviously, and freedom is also kindness, the kindness that God gives to the Jewish people. Maror represents din, justice, the harsh justice that slavery represents, the suffering that we had, the bitter times, the crying, the torture that we had under the Egyptians. So on the one hand, you have matzah. The first question is on the right, which represents freedom. On the left, you have maror, the bitterness, the judgment. And then we'll just go to the two bottom ones for a second and say that the tefillah, when we dip, what are we dipping? We're dipping the maror into charoses. We dip, there's many different ways of understanding it, but for our purposes, we'll say that the charoses represents mortar. It represents the physical world. And justice and the harshness of justice is tied to the materialism. In Maral's world, not having many possessions is freedom, and therefore slavery is associated with the material world. And therefore the material world is the mortar. It's that which binds us and keeps us connected to the ground, which is really what enslaves us. And that's on the left-hand side, the top being justice, the bottom being the charoses, which you dip. On the right-hand side, you have the freedom, which matzah represents, and you have the leaning. When you lean, it's a symbol of freedom. You're a free man. He also says it represents the idea of yeshiva, of settling down, of permanence, but permanence from a spiritual point of view, that you're free as an individual. So on the right-hand side, you have freedom and the permanence of freedom. On the left-hand side, you have justice and materialism and the permanence of suffering, which materialism represents. So what's left to be in the middle? In the middle, perhaps, is that middle question is, why is this different? That's God. But God, who's represented to us in our connection to God through bringing the offering. What happens on the night of Pesach? The Jews brought the lamb or goat, actually, either one, and through that, they're connecting to God, and God is understanding that they want to be outside of the ties of slavery that the Egyptians represent, and therefore they're not allowed to leave their home. Read the story. They're not allowed to leave their home that night. They have to stay separate from the outside world of the Egyptian society and the slavery that represents, and therefore they're completely and totally devoted to God. And the Pesach, the offering which they brought that day, is supposed to be eaten in biblical times, in temple times, was supposed to be eaten with the matzah and the maror. You have to eat them together. The matzah being the freedom, the maror representing the slavery, and you bring them together and united. And that's what makes us whole. The idea is that Tiferes, beauty, which is that central point, is the ability to merge freedom and not so much slavery, but the material world, the spiritual world with the material world, our intellectual side with our emotional side. And either one of these by itself might not work. Certainly on the left-hand side, the side of materialism, we'll get bogged down in our day-to-day lives and forget our spirituality, forget our connection to God. But even on the other side, you can't live a life just purely of spirituality, of intellectualism, of just a world of ideas. You have to survive in this world. The problem is when you start surviving in this world, you get dragged down into that world. The trick is to blend the two and to have a balance. And that's what Tiferes, the middle point, is beauty. Beauty is the ability to balance the two extremes and put them together. And that's what the Pesach represents. The Pesach is the time when the family gets together, just like we do the Seder night, and they're devoting themselves to God irrespective of all of the problems that exist outside of them. They're eating a meal, they're involving themselves in the material world, but it's an offering to God. And the word karban, offering, really means karav, to bring close. You're creating a connection to God. And that connection to God is really what unites everything. And therefore, the answer to the question is to the question of Nishtanah halayla hazeh mikol elos. Why is this night different than all other nights? It's because we have the Jewish people and God and our connection to the Torah. And there's a famous Zohar, the most important Kabbalistic work, which says Yisrael v'araisa v'kuchabrichu chadhu. The Jewish people, the Torah, and God are all one, and it's united through this night of the Seder, where we're actually taking the physical world and taking all of the materialism that we have, and we're devoting it to God through a sense of that which the matzah represents of spirituality and freedom to express ourselves in a way which expresses our individuality and our ability to connect to God, and that's what puts it all together. That fifth element is the central point. It's the focus that connects all the different extremes and all the different elements that exist in this world and pulls it all together. And that's hopefully a message that we can understand in the Nishtanah and brings us to our own life, that we have to try to remember constantly that we have to create balance in this world. We have to focus, we cannot focus on either extreme. We have to be able to take the two and make sure that it's a constant balance in our life.